All through my childhood, I was fascinated by my father's workshop. It was in the basement of the old house I grew up in. This was a space he had claimed for himself, a dusty, tool-strewn haven off in the corner where he built and designed things, fixed problems, and probably thought about big life stuff. It's possible my fascination began with the poster of Cheryl Ladd that hung on the workshop door featuring about 9 miles of cleavage. But it was more about all the Midwestern exotica inside, all of his tools, a hammer, an anvil. Who owns an anvil? My dad and Wile E. Coyote. But it was more the proximity to my father that drew me, the way I could sit there with him as he worked, watching and learning, sometimes helping. He was not the sort of emo, wisdom-dropping dad like I saw on TV, but I learned some of life's most valuable lessons by way of his table saw and a drill press. Soon enough, I grew up into something like a man and bought a house of my own, which, not coincidentally, was a falling down wreck that required not only the tricks and skills I'd learned from my father, but also his frequent help. He walked in the first time, looked around, and said, "There's nothing but memory holding this place up." And then he said, "Let's fix it." To my great fortune, this house came equipped with a pretty Italian Catholic girl who taught me even more than my father. We made our family there. She taught me all about life, all about relationships, and all about the politics of dancing, which I needed to learn badly. Meanwhile, as young men will do, I started to wonder about the big questions: where I come from, where I'm going, the meaning of life, the meaning of death. When you're young, these questions are compelling because they're hypothetical. As you get older, they're compelling because they're not. They become real. And so it happened that my father-in-law died. We were at the funeral home making the arrangements, and I saw off in the corner a cardboard coffin. I called Gina over and said, "That's what I want to be buried in." She said, "You are not going to be buried in a cardboard box." With that, I became convinced I wanted to be buried in a cardboard box. Not long afterward, the family was gathered to celebrate my father's 80th birthday. Over a few beers, I told him about the cardboard casket, and he immediately became interested. Gina renewed her objection, and I looked at him and I said, "You know, you and I could build a casket for practically nothing." He thought this was a brilliant idea. As it turns out, there are very few regulations on caskets. Not only that, but there's a thriving industry selling these things. You can buy a casket with overnight shipping from Amazon.com. You can buy all kinds of novelty caskets, such as this coffin made of bacon. It comes complete with an air freshener, quote, "for when you get that buried underground, not so fresh feeling." So we got started. My dad was a retired civil engineer, and he loved designing things. We drew up a set of plans, bought a stack of lumber at Home Depot, and started in on this slightly morbid, more or less seat-of-the-pants father and son project. I began making trips out to his workshop, and it took on a life of its own. As a writer, I began to see this pursuit as an undeniable metaphor, a tangible way to get my head around the big questions of life and death. My dad was in his 80s, and I was nearing 50. The coffin seemed like a way to explore all this and write about it. And then right in the middle of this, my mother died unexpectedly following a heart attack. As happens when we lose a parent, the notion of mortality changed immediately and dramatically. The notion that life is short becomes real once you have real evidence. Then, a year and 3 days after my mother's death, my best friend since high school, John Puya, also died. Other than Gina, this was the person I had most closely shared my growing up with. We were constant companions and experienced all of our coming-of-age moments together, our kids, music, mischief. We talked about everything. A long time ago, as a writer, I came to understand an important truth. You don't get ideas. Ideas get you. Anytime I've tried to control a subject, it has proven to have a life of its own. In this case, the writing gods seem to be taunting me. You want to write about mortality? We'll give you some real shit to think about. I've never really believed in the idea of writing therapy. Writing is my work, it's my job. But the experience of writing through the big, difficult questions of loss and grief as I was experiencing them showed me the value of stories. I could be with my mother and with John every day, just in different ways. So my dad and I continued building this thing. And it became pretty evident that the real reason for the pursuit was simply to spend time with him. Before my friend had died, we had set up a standing breakfast date, which we agreed was both artificial and genuine, a way to keep our friendship alive. The project with my dad felt the same. Meanwhile, he was hard to pin down in the workshop, running all over the world. Here he is in France, in front of a castle in the mountains, looking like he's on top of the world. So it ended up taking a couple of years, but we finally did finish the casket. As you might imagine, storing a casket for what I hope will be many, many years presents its own challenges. I decided to fit it with shelves and use it as a bookcase, but this is what happens when you get it up on end and leave the room for a tape measure. The writing part, meanwhile, has turned into a book, Furnishing Eternity. It was released on January 2nd. 3 days later, my dad died. He'd had cancer for 5 years, but through all that, he seemed like the most alive person I knew. The last thing he built in his workshop was his own casket, a beautiful testament to his craft and his whimsical nature. The last book he read was this one. His story was complete, and he knew that. When he knew his time was growing short, he said to me one night, "I'm not sad about dying. The only thing that makes me sad is that other people will be sad." He wanted us to mourn him with joy. So I'll remember him as he's pictured here on his 85th birthday last March. He'd always wanted to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge, and so we made an adventure of it. We walked its length from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and we got to the other side, and we sat down and had a beer and talked for a long time. Thank you.